All right, everybody, it's the Combatcast with the man called Dave and Chevy, and we are going to talk about this past weekend's fight night in the UK, Evolov versus Murphy. We're going to talk about this weekend's fight night, Adesanya versus Pyfer. And before we get to all of that, Chevy, why don't we tell people what we got coming up on future episodes?
April 4th, UFC Fight Night, Moicano versus Duncan. That's a fun Apex main card there, 6 p.m. And then April 11th, UFC 327, Prohaska versus Olberg, 9 p.m. from Miami. That's for the vacant light heavyweight belt. And then April 18th, UFC Fight Night, Burns versus Malat. That's 10 p.m. from Winnipeg. Yeah, Gilbert Burns, probably, old vet on his way out. Mike Malat, dark horse in the division kind of thing going on there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Kind of reminds me a little bit of, I don't want to say, I think Pfeiffer's got a little more pretend, but yeah, it's similar though. A dark horse against somebody, possibly on their way out. But yeah, before we get to this weekend's fight night, let's go back and talk about this past weekend's Evolov versus Murphy. We had Luke Riley and Mike Aswell Jr., as we talked about in the co-main event spot that we wondered about. Any other fights you want to talk about before we get into the co-main and main? Card
overall was not a lot of fun. There was only like 4 finishes out of the 12 or 13 fights or whatever, but there were some highlights. So Mason Jones versus Axel Sola. That was a fun fight. Mason Jones got rocked. He ends up coming back and getting a decision. Roman Dolidze versus Christian Leroy Duncan. CLD got a decision, continues his win streak there. And then MVP, who was number 13, was fighting unranked Sam Patterson, who was his training partner. And it showed this ended up being a glorified sparring match where neither guy really touched one another. MVP gets a decision. I do think that his contract is up or about to be up, and don't think he's happy with the UFC. So I would imagine you'll see him in MVP fighting on MVP as MVP, making a lot more money. So he's good for him.
You could do a boxing match with him and Jake Paul, even though I don't know if Jake Paul would like somebody with that stylistic fight, although he's bigger, so you'd like that. But you could do a boxing, or you could just put him on an MMA card. He's kind of tailor-made to go out there and make some money in that landscape right now, as long as there's opportunities to be had.
Yeah. Let's get this co-main event here. Luke Riley versus Michael Aswell Jr.
So this was interesting. I have my notes here. I thought Riley, to me, it looked like he was putting on a little more pressure of the two. But if you look at the stats, Aswell Jr. actually, I believe, outstruck him. Although, all the rounds were competitive. I thought Riley was a little more accurate, I felt like. I didn't actually look at the percentages, but that's just watching the fight, I felt like he had the harder shots overall, but I wouldn't say by much. I thought Aswell Jr. was in the fight the whole time. And honestly, it was one of those fights that afterwards, if you told me the other guy won, I wouldn't have been super shocked. So, good for Riley Jr. here, but I didn't come away. When we talked last week about how, we criticized this co-main event and I watched it, I was hoping to be wrong a little bit. You know what I mean? It's not going to be wrong because it's just two named guys, but I was hoping for this really great, performance, especially being the second fight of Riley in the UFC. And, he got the win. So good for him. But I didn't come away thinking hey, this guy needs to be in more co-main events.
Yeah, I wasn't super impressed with him, but that could just be UFC jitters. I mean, you're making your UFC debut. You already have all this hype behind him from Cage Warriors. So, a lot of people in the crowd had already seen him fight, and the commentary team was hyping him up and everything. I didn't see the hype. You could definitely see some potential, but I didn't think it was a great performance. But, like I said, UFC jitters. So, I'm not ready to cast him aside or anything, but I'm also not ready to say he's anywhere near being a champ in the UFC.
No, I don't think he didn't show me that he belongs to that co-main event spot anytime soon. Gifted that opportunity, but I didn't see anything that said, hey, let's put him back there. Glad he got the win. Keep my eye on him as a prospect, but at the end of the day, I'm not even going to predict a potential fight for this guy because he's so young in this game. Let's just see how his career continues to evolve. But hey, at the end of the day, you got the win, and that's all that mattered. But yeah, given the spotlight and everything here, it's still kind of okay, no, he's just a new guy. Let's see how he does.
Well, I assume that the treatment he's getting is because he's teammates with Patty. Patty was in his corner.
Right.
We know how he carried Molly McCann. I was a Molly McCann fan, but she wasn't the best fighter or anything, and she got a lot of favors from the UFC too. So Luke Riley might be getting a lot as well going forward, but we'll see. But anyway, let's talk about the main event here. Movsar Evloev versus Lerryan Murphy.
Yeah, I was doing some stuff at this time when I started watching this fight, but early on, I thought Murphy was winning this fight. The first, I would say 3 rounds, I thought Murphy did enough to win. But I did think, obviously, Movsar came on very strong those last 2 rounds, the championship rounds. So,
but he got a point taken in the 4th round.
A point taken, yeah. So I know Michael Bisping said this. I personally thought Murphy did enough with the point deduction to win the decision here. I'm not calling it a robbery or anything because, again, I thought those last 2 rounds, Movsar definitely won. So it really depends. If you give him one other round, I could see where he win, but then you have the point deduction. So that's where I thought Murphy would have won, or this was possibly even a draw. I don't know. I didn't think Movsar won the fight, but I also didn't think it was a robbery. But I'm also, at the same time, going into this, I thought Movsar was going to dominate this fight. And that wasn't disrespect to Murphy. I just thought, oh, man. So, and Murphy looked like, is there something, he got injured in this fight too?
Yeah, something happened I don't know if it was during the fight or he came in with it, but some sort of hip injury. So that could have hindered him. That a hip injury takes away a lot of your power on your shots. You can't throw kicks, which he uses a lot of kicks. Your takedown defense is significantly diminished. So that does make a big difference. But if it happened in the fight and it was something Movsar did, respect to him, but he came in with an injury, that's not the guy you want to be fighting with an injury if that was the case.
But I guess I just want to say, in a loss, and even though, like I said, I know Michael Bisping thought he did enough to win, in a loss, though, his stock actually kind of rose for me a little bit. I just thought, and that's not taken away from Evloev. I just thought I was really overall impressed that Murphy was hanging in there with him as well as he did. And I don't know if I should have been because, undefeated going into this, but at the same time, I guess just seeing Evloev, I thought, oh, okay, his style will win dominantly here. And that was not the case.
Yeah, Movsar used his boxing way more than I thought that he would. So, Murphy did do a good job of getting up when he was taken down in the early rounds. But, like I said, I don't know how much that hip injury affected him. So I personally thought Movsar won. I gave Lerryan the first round, and then I gave the rest of the rounds to Movsar, but the fight was really close. So that was just in my first time watching through. I'm not really trying to score rounds so much when I'm watching. I'm just, normally I would go back and watch the fight again, but I didn't get a chance to this week when everyone's, very split on what it would be. I would go back and watch it again, but didn't get a chance to. But yeah, I thought I saw the tweets and stuff on the side where people were saying that Murphy was winning. And I just never saw that. I mean, maybe the second round or maybe the third round.
Yeah.
But I just thought that he won every round except for the first round. So
I think that's the thing with those rounds 2 and 3. So they were close enough that you could have gone either way. And I think that's where some of the divide is. Because if you did give him rounds 2 and 3, then especially with a point deduction, you think, oh, he's winning this fight. Because I've never been a big proponent of, oh, the other guy finishes strong, championship round, you got to finish strong. To me, it's that's not how the scoring works.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a real sport if you're doing it that way. That would have to be in the rules that you weigh those heavier, but it's not currently. So
I heard that Sean Silva said afterwards that regardless of who wins, that he'd be getting a title shot. I don't know how true that is, but I wouldn't be shocked.
Dana didn't want to say that Movsar was definitely getting a title shot, even though Volkanovski was like, that's who I'm fighting. I mean, the guy is 20-0 or something like that now, and he just beat another undefeated guy. It's you have to give it to him. And I actually think that Volkanovski versus Evloev is an interesting fight. I think Volkanovski's counter wrestling is enough to fend off Evloev. Think of how good he was doing against Islam. So
right.
I bet I wouldn't be surprised if Volkanovski took him down. And on the feet, he just figures guys out. So
yeah,
I don't think either one of them really. I wouldn't favor either one of them against Volkanovski, even though he's in his late 30s.
No, I agree, and I think Murphy, even though like I said, I thought the thing with me was the point deduction, which was kind of swaying me a little bit. But overall, I still thought like if they fight again, I'm still going Evilov. But I think stylistically, I think Murphy actually matches better up with Volk as a potential fight. Right. So I kind of see what you're saying because of the counter wrestling that Volk has been able to pull off in the past and stuff too. I just think that, I agree with you. I think he's a good style matchup. But I think you got to give Evilov the title shot at the end of the day here. He deserves it.
Yeah. I mean, John Silva just lost to Diego Lopez, who lost to Volkanovski twice. So
we've been down his road.
But also the UFC does not care about anything. There's no predicting what they're gonna do. So we'll all find out when Dana finds out when he reads it off his phone while he's doing an Instagram live.
Yes, sir. Check out our Patreon talk last week of what we feel the state of the UFC is right now. As we go on, let's talk about upcoming fight night. This fight night, I will say, I'm very excited about the main event and co-main event and some of the other fights on here too, actually. Israel Adesanya versus Joe Pyfer from Seattle, Washington. Looks like a 8 p.m. Eastern time start. Let's talk about some other fights on this card first.
Yeah, this card seems like it'd be a lot more fun. So I'm kind of looking forward to this one. On the prelims, you got Ricky Simone versus Adrian Yanez. That's a fun fight. You got number 8 heavyweight Marcin Tybura fighting Tyrell Fortune, who doesn't even have a picture on the UFC website. He's number 8. He's fighting unranked, non-pictured Tyrell Fortune. Heavyweight division in shambles. Chase Hooper versus Lance Gibson Jr. That's fun. And possible fight of the night, Ignacio Bahamondes versus Tofik Musayev. Don't know too much about Musayev except that he comes from Bellator and Ryzen, he has like 18 KOs or something. He knocks a lot of people out. We know what Bahamondes does. Super exciting fighter, also a KO artist. So everyone keep an eye on that one. Undercard, Terrance McKinney versus Kyle Nelson. Both guys like to bang and go early. Terrance McKinney rarely makes it out of the first round, whether he's on his back or standing. At the end of the fight, we don't know, but it probably isn't going around 2. And then Michael Chiesa is either fighting Nico Price or Carlston Harris. I don't know. Somebody pulled out, but I don't know what the original fight was. So either way, I think it could be Chiesa's last fight. I don't know how many fights he has on his contract, but it seems like it'd be time for him to hang him up after this one.
And he's from the Seattle, Washington area.
Yes, he is. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Chiesa, he won that Ultimate Fighter live, which I always thought
the hardest Ultimate Fighter for sure.
Yeah, and it was so grueling because the previous ones are taped, so you can kind of manipulate the schedule a little bit. Whereas he literally had to fight, pretty much.
Well, he's the wave too. It takes forever to do that. So
he lost his father during that show too.
Right, that was at lightweight too, where he was killing himself to make weight. Now he's at 170 and he kills himself to make 170. He's a big dude.
Yeah, I always thought Chiesa had a solid career. I don't know that he's going to go into UFC Hall of Fame or anything, but he had a solid, successful career. And
great, funky grappling. Never really mastered any striking, but made wrestling exciting.
Oh, I will say that one of my favorite things that and I like Chiesa, but one of my favorite things, he wasn't on the well-receiving end of. I get it. When he was young in his career and hadn't wins, his first loss, I believe, was to Joe Lozon in the UFC. In a fight that was competitive and then got stopped, and he thought he should have gone. And he was capable, but it was understandable stopped. But I remember he kept trying to do rematches, and Joe Lozon just responded, "Rematches are dumb." And I thought that's a great
owned, yeah. Yeah. Let's get into this co-main event here. We got a couple good fights here at the end of this card. Alexa Grasso versus Maycee Barber.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Maycee Barber, 15-2, 6 KOs, 2 subs, 7 decisions. She's on a 7-fight win streak since her last loss to Alexa Grasso by decision in 2021. She's had performance of the night, and she's tied with Manon Fiorot for second most knockouts in UFC women's flyweight division history, only behind Valentina. So, she's one of the more stronger women, I would say, in this division. Grasso, though, 16-5-1, 4 KOs, 2 subs, 10 decisions. She, of course, is a former UFC women's flyweight champion. She's had fight of the night, performance of the night. She is on a 2-fight losing streak right now, having just lost her title to the legendary Valentina and Natalie Silva, who, could be fighting for the title next for all I know. So, yeah. So no shame in those losses whatsoever. I will say I got to favor Grasso still, only because she has the prior win. I'm not saying she's going to win, but I will also say this is the best time for Maycee Barber to probably have this fight after you're getting all those momentums, all that wins, all those wins and all that momentum. And now you're facing Grasso at this point, who just lost the title, just lost the fight. Her back's against the corner. I think it's an interesting matchup. I'll pick with my heart. I like Grasso, but I'm going to go Maycee Barber by decision.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think just timing wise, Maycee is at this high and Grasso's at this low. And I think those Valentina fights and the Silva fight have taken a lot out of Grasso. Not to say that she can't still be champ, but I just think that Maycee Barber, you know, although probably technically less skilled everywhere, is just more of a dog, just a fighter instead of like an athlete. I mean, she's a good athlete too, but she just is tough as shit. And I think she's just gonna kind of be the aggressor in there. And, you know, she was very young the first time that she fought Grasso. I think she's learned a lot in the octagon since then. So I think she grinds out a decision win. Main event here, number 4, Israel Adesanya versus number 14, Joe Pyfer.
So while I was looking at my phone, I wanted to check a few things for this fight in particular, some interesting stats here. Joe Pyfer, 15-3, 9 KOs, 4 subs, 2 decisions. He's won 7 out of his last 8 fights. I forgot to check his amateur career, but as far as I know, what I've seen is he's never been knocked out. He's had an injury that stopped him, and he's lost decision, but he's never been knocked out. So I think that's interesting when you're going up against a striker at the level of Adesanya. 24-5, 16 KOs, 8 decisions for Adesanya. This guy's already had a Hall of Fame fight with Kelvin Gastelum. More on that in our Patreon talk later. Former UFC middleweight champion, 5 successful title defenses in his first reign. He, of course, was a 2-time middleweight champion. He's a legend. And unfortunately, we talked about this. A lot of legends might be leaving the UFC soon. It's just about that time. Will this be his time? It is interesting because I feel like this is going to go 2 ways. I feel like Joe Pyfer is either going to take him out early, like possibly in the first 2 rounds, you know, catch him with that power. But as the fight goes on, despite the fact he's on a 3-fight losing streak to some of the best in the world, I feel like Adesanya, with his experience and his level of his striking, I feel like I'm going to favor Adesanya in the later rounds. Man, I like Joe. I want to see Joe kind of get some momentum, but I don't really want to see Adesanya go yet. I'm going to pick Adesanya. Again, probably going with my heart here, but I'm going to go late 4th round TKO.
Yeah, I think Prime Izzy would probably make the Joe Pyfer that fought Gastelum anyway look silly. So, you know, but time comes for us all. Izzy is not in his prime anymore. I'm with you. I still think I give Adesanya the edge.
Yeah.
But if Pyfer has learned not to headhunt like in that Gastelum fight, his chances go way up. He really only needs to touch Izzy one time to put him out. He holds the record on that power cube thing. You know, he broke, Francis Ngannou's record, which I don't know how I feel about that or whatever. Take that with a grain of salt. But yeah, apparently he punches harder than Francis Ngannou. So
I've always thought the same thing, by the way. I've always been suspicious of that. This doesn't make sense to my
UFC totally wouldn't, just dismiss Francis Ngannou because he's not in there anymore. So they wouldn't lie about his power cube numbers. But anyway, Joe Pyfer, regardless, punches very fucking hard. So Izzy needs to mind his P's and Q's. But I'm with you. I don't think it's time for him to. I don't think he has such a decline where he can't dodge a headhunting power puncher. He's seen that a million times throughout his career. So I'm hoping he's able to do it one more time and he can style on Joe Pyfer. Although I'm with you. I'm a fan of Joe Pyfer. I just am not ready to see Izzy go out on his, face down yet. So Israel by decision, I think. I think Joe Pyfer makes it to the end, but it's also, I could also see him tiring Joe out. Joe's trying to swing, he gets tired, and then that's when Izzy puts it on you and he'll finish you. But I'm going to go decision.
That's what I meant by late 4th round TKO. I didn't expand. I do see Pyfer getting tired as the fight goes on. Again, I could also see Pyfer taking him out early. And if Pyfer is continuing to evolve, it's not going to be like the most shocking thing if he can finish him late either. For Izzy, it's like, too, it's actually very similar. The main event and co-main event are very similar in the sense I feel like both people who I would concede as the underdogs, maybe slight underdogs, or at least not as established, are fighting the top people at the right
cream of the crop. Yeah. At the right time. Yeah.
So, and I also just think for Izzy, it's interesting because, and this is maybe just me thinking, I wonder how many fights he has left on his contract, because for him at this stage, like if he can get a win and he only has like one other fight, like he's a guy that could make some money and be a big name, out there for an MVP promotions or something too.
Him and Darren Till or something, MVP would be really fun. But I don't know. I think Izzy has stated that he kind of wants to hang around, even if like being champ isn't in the cards. He just wants like fun fights. But
yeah,
I don't know what fun fights there are for him anymore. There's no like real like I don't know. Just like that division. You've kind of fought all the people who really want to see you fight. So, and
I don't want to see you fight Alex Pereira anymore because
I don't want to see Pereira. I don't want to see Hosma. Like, I don't want to see any. Yeah.
So, but we will talk.
I'd rather he went to MVP and made a bunch more money and was really put on as a star like he should be.
Absolutely, I'd love to see him fight like a a Darren Till, like you said, for instance, or
Luke Rockhold.
Luke Rockhold, MVP himself, a Mike Perry, or anybody of those guys would be interesting. Izzy and Bare Knuckle would be one of those guys I wouldn't hate the idea because he is such an elite striker. I'd be interested. I'm not totally on board with it because I could see that going really bad too, but I could definitely think he'd be interesting to watch. So I don't know. It's one of those funny moments where you almost want to say all the top stars you want to see in the UFC, but Izzy's one of those guys I think there's more interesting fights for him actually elsewhere at this point in his career.
Right.
But that's going to be it for our talk about the fight nights. Let's tell people what we got coming up one more time.
All right, April 4th, UFC Fight Night, Moicano versus Duncan, 6 p.m. from the Apex. April 11th, UFC 327, Prohaska versus Olberg for the vacant light heavyweight belt. And then April 18th, UFC Fight Night, Gilbert Burns versus Mike Malott, 10 p.m. from Winnipeg.
All right, some good cards coming up. Again, Adesanya versus Pyfer, big fight card this weekend. At least a great main event and a great co-main event. And we'll talk more about it next week. And as for you Patreon members, we're going to talk more about